Two men tried to conquer the entire world. They never met, they never could. One came from the west. He moved like weather, and by 30 had taken more of the world than any person before him. We still say his name like a title, the Great. The other came from the east, from a kingdom most of the world had never heard of. He was younger when they handed him a throne. He was 13. History remembers the first one as the conqueror. It remembers the second when it remembers him at all, as a monster, a book burner, a tyrant in a tomb full of clay soldiers and rivers of poison. But here is the thing nobody tells you. One of them conquered the whole known world, and the moment his heart stopped, that world fell apart in his hands like wet paper. The other, the monster, built something so durable that you are still living inside it today, 2,200 years later. You just do not call it by his name. To understand what this boy did, you have to understand the world he was born into, because the country he came from, the one we now call China, did not exist. It never had, not once. For more than 500 years, the land between the great rivers had been a floor of broken kingdoms. Historians call it the Warring States, and the name is honest. 7 big powers and a litter of small ones, at each other's throats for so long that war was not an event. War was simply the weather. A whole civilization had grown up that never knew a single year in which everyone belonged to the same thing. There had once been a king over all of it, a Joe king, the son of heaven, but for centuries no one had truly obeyed him, and by the time this boy was born, the Joe line was finished. So when people in that world imagined the future, they could not imagine one country. There was no word for the thing this boy would build. Now look west, 100 years earlier. Greece was also a floor of broken pieces, proud little city-states with their own laws and gods and grudges, fighting as reliably as the seasons. A world apart, neither knowing the other existed, both born into the same problem. Too many kingdoms, and none able to imagine being one. And into each half is born a man who is going to try to swallow all of it. But here is where they already split. When Alexander looks at all that Greek brilliance, he does not think, I will weld these into one country that runs whether I am alive or dead. He thinks East, Persia, Egypt, the rim of the known earth. The boy in the East wants a different thing entirely, and he inherits a machine he did not build, already 100 years old, whose inventor had been executed by it. Let me tell you what that boy actually inherited, because it is the secret of this entire story. 100 years before he was born, Qin was a frontier backwater that nobody feared. Then a man named Shangyang walked into the Qin court with an idea so total it would still run the country 2,000 years later. He did not believe in good men, he believed in one thing: law, impersonal, written, ruthless law that applied to everyone the same. He tore up the old rule that you were born into your rank. From now on, a man rises by what he measurably does. Heads from the battlefield, land and title, grain in the field, rank. Birth means nothing, achievement is counted. He turned a kingdom into a machine for converting human beings into war and grain. And the machine did not care who built it. When his protector died and the new king turned against him, Shangyang tried to run and discovered on the road that under his own laws a man could not stay at an inn without papers, the papers he had written. He was trapped by the system he had invented, dragged back, and killed. And then, the records say, his body was torn apart by chariots, pulled in opposite directions in front of the people. The man who taught Qin that the law must devour everyone equally was devoured equally by the law, and the machine did not so much as shudder. It kept running, waiting for someone with enough will to point it at the whole world. That is what the boy inherited, a weapon that ran on rules. And what did Alexander inherit? A weapon that ran on him. Philip leaves him the finest army in the world and a tutor named Aristotle. But that army held together for one reason: the loyalty of men to the charisma of the king at the front. When Philip was murdered and the 20-year-old took the throne, the whole thing held because Alexander personally was electrifying enough to hold it. One inherited a machine that would work no matter who sat on the throne. The other inherited a spell. His name was Zheng. In the year we would call 246 before the Common Era, the king of Qin died, and the crown came down onto the head of a 13-year-old. Think about that as a person, not a date. A boy on the most dangerous throne in the world, generals who have killed more men than he has met bowing to him, and he cannot make one obey out of fear, because he is a child, and a child can be managed. So for years he was managed. The real power sat with a chancellor named Le Buet, a merchant of staggering wealth who had, the records suggest, helped engineer the boy's path to the throne. The court was a nest of older, cleverer men, each certain the boy was a chair they sat in until they wanted it. And there was a plot. A man named Lao Ai, smuggled into the palace through the Queen Mother's household, raised a rebellion to seize the state. And here is the man inside the boy. He waits. He lets the powerful men around him grow careless and lets the plot ripen. And when it breaks, he crushes it with a completeness that should make your skin cold. The rebels are executed. Lao Ai is torn apart, and then he removes Lu Buet himself, the man who had made him, and pushes him toward an end the chancellor met, the records say, by his own hand. By his early 20s, every hand that ever held a string attached to him has been cut off, including the hand that first put the crown on his head. He does not raise his voice. He removes the obstacle and moves on. The boy, who had been everyone's puppet, had learned the lesson of his whole childhood. Trust is a door you leave open. He would spend the rest of his life closing them. Alexander comes to the throne the same way, young and over bodies. When Philip is murdered, the 20-year-old moves with the same cold speed, executing rivals, securing the army before anyone can take it. And when the ancient city of Thebes rebels, he razes it to the ground and sells its people into slavery. 2 young men, 2 thrones taken in blood, the same message. There will be no second attempt. But notice what each will is reaching for. Alexander feels a pull outward, toward Persia, toward the names in the poems Aristotle read him. Zheng feels a pull of a different shape, not outward, down. He looks at the 6 kingdoms, and a thought forms that no king before him has let himself finish. What if they could be one? What if I made them be? The boy had become a will, and the will picked a target. All of it. Alexander goes first because he is the one you know. In 334, before the Common Era, he crosses into Asia with maybe 40,000 men to attack the Persian Empire, the largest on earth, a thing so vast it makes Macedon look like a village. At the Granicus, he wins. At Issus, he shatters a Persian army many times his size and sends the Persian king fleeing for his life. He takes the whole coast, then Egypt, where they crown him a pharaoh and a god. And then, in 331, on a dusty plain called Gaugamela, he aims his cavalry like a spear straight at the Persian king, and breaks the greatest empire on earth in an afternoon. He is 25 and he does not stop. He burns Persepolis to the ground and marches east into lands the Greeks barely had names for, fighting war elephants in the monsoon all the way to the edge of India, until his own exhausted army refuses to take one more step, and weeping he turns back. No one had ever conquered so much, so fast. By any measure of pure conquest, Alexander is the greatest who ever lived. Now go back 100 years to the east and watch a different kind of conqueror. Starting around 230, the machine goes to work, and the will points it. Zheng does not gamble everything on a beautiful charge. He runs a plan, and the plan even has a name. Befriend the far, swallow the near. Bribe the ministers you can buy. Kill the generals you cannot. And one by one swallow the neighbours you can reach. And in barely 9 years, 6 kingdoms that had survived 5 centuries of warfare fall. But only once does it nearly come undone, in the most famous scene in Chinese history. One kingdom, unable to beat the machine, decided instead to kill the will driving it. The state of Yan sent an envoy named Qin Shi, carrying gifts of surrender and a map. To present it, you unrolled it before the king yourself, and rolled inside, the records say, was a poisoned dagger. The map unrolls, the blade appears at the end of it. Qin Shi lunges, grabs the king's sleeve, strikes, and Zheng, the most powerful man in the east, does the most human thing imaginable. He runs. He tears his sleeve off and runs around a pillar in his own throne room, unable to get his ceremonial sword out of its scabbard because it is too long and his hands are shaking. His own guards cannot help him because there was a law, his law, that no armed man could approach the king on the dais without permission. So they stood at the edge, unarmed, watching their king run for his life, because the very system built to keep him safe had frozen them. Finally, someone shouts at him to push the scabbard behind him and draw across his body. It works. He kills the man. And there is the difference between these 2 men in one image. Alexander aims his own body at the enemy king like a weapon. Zheng nearly dies because an enemy got close, survives, and goes back to running the plan. He would trust fewer and fewer people, from that day until almost no one was left. And in 221, the last of the 6 kingdoms falls, and for the first time in history, the East is won. Both men now stand on top of a conquered world, and here is a question that decides everything, the one almost no conqueror ever reaches. The morning after. Now what? Alexander gives the obvious answer, the one almost every conqueror gives. You leave the world as you found it, and you sit on top of it. He keeps the Persian system of provinces and governors more or less intact, now answering to him. He founds cities named after himself, and tries to bind the whole thing together by marrying a Persian princess and asking his men to do the same. But look closely at what holds it together. At the center of every thread is one thing: him. There is no machine underneath, only a brilliant man, standing on a borrowed structure, holding the seam shut with his own hands. Now watch Zheng give the other answer. The answer no one had ever given. His advisors come to him with the obvious plan, the Alexander plan. Put your sons and loyal men on the thrones of the conquered kingdoms as kings, and let them hold the territory for you. And Zheng says no. First, he invents a new word, for himself, because king is no longer big enough. He calls himself Huangdi, which we translate as the first emperor, and declares his line will rule for 10,000 generations. But the title is not the strange part. The strange part is what he does to everyone underneath it. He abolishes the nobility. For all of human history up to that moment, you ran a large territory by carving it among aristocrats who held their lands by blood and ruled their corners like little kings. Zheng tears it out by the root. He carves the empire into districts that ignore the old kingdoms entirely, and over each one he places not a noble, not an heir, but an appointed official. Salaried, trained, removable. A man who holds power not because of his blood, but because the center handed it to him, and whose son inherits nothing. He invented the machine that runs the world you live in right now. Stop and feel what he just did. The bureaucracy, 2,000 years before anyone else would dare. A single body administered by professional officials, reporting up a chain to one center, paid by the state, removable at will. The boy who learned you cannot trust anyone built a system whose whole point was that it did not have to. It did not run on the loyalty of men. It ran on the structure. And here, finally, is the whole duel in one sentence. Alexander made himself the load-bearing wall. Zheng took himself out of the wall and replaced his own body with a system. One of these can survive its founder's death. The other cannot. Zheng is not finished. Having invented the machine, he spends his reign welding it so tightly to reality that it can never be pried apart, because you can tear out the nobles and still watch the pieces drift. Since they do not speak the same language or write the same way, he decrees one writing system, so an order written in the capital can be read 1,000 miles away by a man who speaks a different language but writes the same characters. One currency, one set of weights, one set of measures, one law. He even fixes the width between cart axles, so every wagon runs in the same ruts. These sound like clerical details. They are the technology of unity itself. You cannot hold 1,000 miles together with an army alone. You hold it by making 1,000 miles behave like one object. And along the northern edge, where the old kingdoms had each thrown up their own walls against the riders of the steppe, he did not build the great wall the postcards imply. He connected the walls already there into a single edge that said, all of this inside the line is now one thing. And then the part that gave him his monstrous reputation, and it belongs to the same obsession. So no one could dream of going back to the fractured old world of competing kingdoms and competing philosophies. The records say he gathered up the books, the histories of the kingdoms he had swallowed, the writings of the schools that disagreed with him, and he burned them. He was erasing the memory of the alternative, so there would be nothing for his new world to drift back toward. And while one man pours his whole soul into bolting a world together, the other, 100 years before and half a world west, is decreeing none of this. No single script, no single axle, no single law, no machine of any kind to outlive him. Alexander is still on his horse, still pointing at the next horizon. That is the whole story. One man is welding a world shut so it can never come apart. The other is still trying to swallow it. And the man on the horse is about to run out of road. Far to the west, in a palace in Babylon, the spell is already beginning to flicker, because the builder, too, was about to fall apart. Because there is one enemy that does not care how much of the world you own, and both men meet it young, Alexander dies first. In 323 before the Common Era, back in Babylon he falls ill at a banquet. A fever. About 11-12 days. And the man who beat the greatest empire on earth, who never lost a battle, who marched to the edge of the world, is dead at 32, of something his army could not charge. And the moment he stops breathing, watch. They ask the dying king who should inherit the world, and the records say he answers, or so the story goes, to the strongest, which is another way of saying, to whoever can grab it. There is no machine underneath. There is only the spell, and the spell just died. Now the other one. The first emperor faces the same enemy, and he cannot accept it. So the man who bent an entire civilization to his will turned that will against death itself. He sent expeditions across the sea to find the islands of the immortals, where the stories said an elixir grew that could let a man live forever. One famous voyage, the records say, sailed east with thousands and never came back. And here is the bitter joke at the center of it. The potions his alchemists fed him, the best guess of historians today, contained mercury, the liquid metal. The leading hypothesis, and I want to be careful with the word hypothesis, is that the medicine he took to live forever was slowly poisoning him to death. The cure was the killer, and the fear bent him. He grew secretive, sleeping in different palaces, so no one could know where to find him. So he built the strangest insurance any human ever took out. If he could not escape death, he would outbuild it. The records written by the historian Sima Qian about a century later describe a tomb. Underground, an entire model of his empire. The great rivers and the sea recreated in flowing mercury, under a ceiling set with the stars, with crossbows rigged to fire at any intruder. And we know he had an army made for it, thousands of life-sized clay soldiers, each face different, drawn up to serve a man who refused to stop ruling because he had died. For most of history we filed those mercury rivers under legend, and then the instruments disagreed. Modern surveys found unusually high concentrations of mercury in the soil over the unexcavated tomb mound, and a 2020 study found it in the air above it. Not proof of the rivers. But the dead historian's strangest detail suddenly had the earth itself agreeing with it. Two men, both undone by the one enemy neither will could conquer. One lay down in a bedroom in Babylon and let it take him at 32. The other ran from it across oceans and into a tomb full of poison and clay, and died on the road, the records say, on a tour of his empire. Both died still wanting. And on the day they lie cold, it looks like a tie, or even like Alexander won, because Alexander conquered more. But death is not the end of this story. What happens after the funerals is the whole point. Start with Alexander, because his ending is the simple one. The strongest, it turned out, was nobody. The moment Alexander stopped breathing, his generals turned on each other like dogs over a carcass, and spent the next 40 years fighting for the scraps. His own wife and son were murdered in the scramble. Everything he conquered, gone inside a single generation, because it was never a country. It was one man, and the man was dead. He left a name and a map coming apart before they finished burying him. Now the first emperor, and his ending looks at first even worse. He died far from the capital, and his closest officials, terrified of what would happen when the empire learned its god was dead, hid the body. The records say they packed the imperial carriage with salted fish to cover the smell of the corpse while they raced back to seize control. They forced his able heir to kill himself, and put a weaker son on the throne. The dynasty meant to last 10,000 generations did not last 4 years past its founder. So both failed, both empires fell. If that were the whole story, they would be twins. But it is not the whole story. And here is the difference 2,000 years have been quietly making. When Alexander's empire shattered, the world went back to what it had been. The ground closed over the shape of what he had built, as if he had never built it. When the Qin dynasty shattered, the men who overthrew it, the Han, hated the first emperor. They built their legitimacy on the story that he was a monster, a book-burning tyrant, and then quietly they kept almost everything he had built. The single country, the districts run by appointed officials, the one script, the one currency, the standardized world. They threw away his name and kept his machine, because the machine worked, and because once you have seen 1,000 miles behave like one country, you cannot unsee it, and every dynasty after the Han did the same. For 2,200 years, through 100 rises and falls, the idea held that this land was one country, one administered body, run from a center. Emperors who would have spat on his grave ruled every day inside the structure of his mind. The country we call China today, the most populous nation on earth, is, in a real and unbroken sense, the country that 13-year-old boy decided, against all of history, to invent. He lost his dynasty. He lost his body to the poison he drank to keep it. He lost everything he personally wanted. And he won the one thing he never thought to ask for: permanence. Not for himself, for the idea. So go back to the beginning. 2 men, 2 armies, charging a seam in the earth that opened between them, never able to touch. The one from the west, the great, who conquered more of the world than anyone before him, and built nothing that could outlive his heartbeat, remembered now as a name on a dead map. And the boy from the east, the monster we file under tyrant, and try not to think about, who conquered less and built a machine so durable that he is the only one of the 2 whose work you are still standing inside of, today without even knowing his name. They never met. They never could. 2 young men handed a broken world, both undone by the one enemy no will can conquer. But only one of them is still, quietly, 2,200 years later, winning.